At 3 o'clock in the morning, the house should have been asleep. Instead, the front room in Blackwood was warm, with the stubborn heat of a coal fire. And Bess Hughes sat upright in a chair that had stopped being comfortable hours ago, listening to the little sounds a house makes when it's trying to settle. The clock's hands moved with a patience that felt insulting. The fire made tiny, deliberate clicks as it shifted in its own ash. Outside, wind worried at the seams of the night and found its way through the cracks around the sash window, as if it wanted to come in and see what kind of woman sat awake at this hour, waiting. She told herself she was only being practical. Samuel had said he'd be back. He always came back. Newport was routine. The trains were routine. Even his late nights were, in their own way, predictable. You learn the rhythm of a person, the way you learn the rhythm of rain on your roof. But predictability had limits, and she'd reached them. The room smelled faintly of soot and tea that had gone cold in the cup beside her. Somewhere deeper in the house, the boards creaked as if someone had stepped, then nothing. Bess held her breath. She'd been hearing things like that all night, a kind of nervous listening that turns every ordinary sound into a question. Then the sound came again. Not the boards this time. A voice, clear enough to lift the hairs along her arms, clear enough to cut through the hiss of the fire like a knife. "Bess," it called. And then almost immediately, again, urgent, familiar, unmistakable. "Bess! Bess!" The name didn't float. It landed. It carried weight. It carried Samuel with it the way his boots carried the wet of the roads when he came in from outside. The voice had shape. It had breath. It had that particular impatience he got when he'd been traveling too long and wanted the door open before he had to fumble for the latch. Bess was on her feet before she realized she'd stood. Her heart seemed to wake up all at once, thumping as if it had been sleeping in her chest and had been startled by the shout. Samuel. He was home. Relief hit her so fast it made her dizzy. All the hours of worrying felt suddenly ridiculous, like she'd been frightened by her own shadow. She snatched up the candle from the table and struck the match with hands that were clumsier than she wanted them to be. The flame caught. The room brightened in a narrow, trembling circle. She moved toward the front door, holding the candle out in front of her, already forming words, questions, scolding, the kind of half-angry affection that came with a husband arriving at a shameful hour. She reached the door, felt the cold metal of the latch, and pulled. The porch was right there, and someone was standing on it. Not Samuel. A tall figure, close enough that the candlelight found the edges of it instantly. Black cloth, black shape, the suggestion of a cloak or long coat falling straight down, swallowing the body inside it. On top, a tall hat, silk, the kind that didn't belong to this little porch and this little hour. It made the figure look even taller, even less human, as if it had been stretched by the darkness. The face, if there was a face, was not a face the light wanted to show her. Bess froze in the doorway. The candle flickered in her fist, and the flame leaned sideways, trying to get away. She should have screamed. She should have slammed the door. She should have done something, but she didn't. There was a strange calm that settled over her like a shawl. Not peace, something emptier. Something like the moment after you drop a plate and before it hits the floor, you understand there's no stopping what's coming. The figure didn't move. It didn't lift a hand or tilt its head. It only stood there, inches from the threshold, as if it had been waiting for her to open the door and was now considering whether to step inside. Bess's eyes went to the hat. Because she knew that hat. Samuel's hat. Not in some vague way, not like a woman who knows her husband's coat from across a room. She knew the shine of it, the way the brim curved, the way he'd brush it with his sleeve when it caught dust. He'd worn it often enough that it had become part of the shape of him in her mind. And she remembered him putting it on that Saturday morning, the gesture casual and practiced, the kind of gesture you don't pay attention to until you're alone later, and the memory has sharp edges. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. She blinked. And the porch was empty. There was no tall hat, no cloak, no figure. Only darkness and the low shape of the porch rail and the cold night pressing close. The candle's flame steadied, as if embarrassed by its earlier fear. Bess stood there in the doorway, the latch biting into her palm, unable to decide whether she'd seen something at all. In the silence that followed, the world felt staged, like she'd been shown a scene, and now someone had pulled the curtain away too quickly. She lifted the candle and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air immediately slipping under her nightclothes and raising gooseflesh along her arms. "Samuel?" she called, and her voice sounded small and foolish in the open air. No answer. She moved around the side of the house, the candlelight bouncing over the yard, over the fence, over the rough shape of bushes. Her feet scuffed the ground. The night swallowed up the light beyond the candle's small radius, refusing to show her more. She called again. Nothing? It was the kind of nothing that didn't merely mean absence. It meant the world was deliberately quiet, listening back. She went around the other side, then behind the house, then back to the front again, her breath coming faster. She expected, wanted, needed to hear Samuel's footsteps, his voice, even his irritated laugh telling her she'd spooked herself. But the yard stayed empty. The road beyond the gate stayed empty. Eventually, standing in the cold long enough that her fingers began to ache around the candle, she went back inside. She shut the door gently, as if slamming it might invite something to notice her. She sat down again by the fire, the chair suddenly too big, her body suddenly too light. She stared at the coals until the hours blurred. At some point, she lay down. Not in bed exactly. More like she folded herself onto it the way people do when they are too tired to do anything properly. Dawn came, gray and reluctant, and found her in the same state. Awake, waiting, and no longer certain of anything. The day before, Saturday, had started like so many of Samuel Hughes's Saturdays that it barely deserved a marker. He left Blackwood with the kind of purposeful tiredness that comes from years of routine. He was 57, not old, but he carried his age in his joints and in his patience. He was a salt merchant, and the work required him to travel, to bargain, to haul himself through long hours in town and then haul himself back again. He kissed Bess quickly, a gesture that was affectionate but already half thinking about trains, invoices, and the day's demands. "You'll be back for the 5, she said. Not as a question, but as a habit. "That's the plan," he told her. And he smiled the way a man smiles when he knows plans are only as strong as the day allows. Bess had been uneasy even then, though she couldn't have named why. She'd had a dream earlier in the week. Thursday, she would later say. Strange enough that she'd woken with her heart pounding, the images clinging like cobwebs. In the dream, Samuel had been surrounded by men, faces she couldn't place but could describe, she insisted, down to the shape of their shoulders and the way they moved. There had been some sort of scuffle, hands grabbing, bodies shifting in the dark, and then Samuel had fallen. Not a dramatic fall, not a theatrical one. Just a sudden collapse to the ground that had the finality of a door closing. Dreams were foolish things, but this one had made a mark. It lingered in her all week, like a bruise she kept touching. When Samuel left that morning, she told him, more sharply than she meant to, that he must be careful. She didn't explain the dream. She didn't need to. He saw something in her face and promised, mild and patient, that he would. Then he was gone. Samuel's day in Newport stretched like an elastic band pulled too tight. Business demanded attention, and attention demanded time. There were delays and small frustrations, the kind that felt minor while they happened, but collectively added weight to the hours. He worked with the steady endurance of a man who'd learned that exhaustion didn't excuse failure. By late afternoon, his mind already began traveling home. He pictured the fire at Blackwood. He pictured the chair where Bess would sit. He pictured the taste of tea and the feel of the bed. But the day didn't release him. Even when evening came and the light outside softened and cooled, he found himself still at work, still bound to obligations he could not simply walk away from. By the time he headed for the station, Newport's night had thickened. The streets smelled of damp stone and smoke, the kind of cold that creeps into your sleeves and makes your shoulders hunch without permission. He took a train north, toward the valley, toward home. The carriage rocked him gently, and the tiredness that had been collecting in his body all day suddenly asserted itself. He had meant to stay awake. He had meant to watch for his stop. But tiredness is not polite. It does not wait its turn. It simply takes what it wants. The rhythm of the tracks became a lullaby. His eyelids grew heavy, then heavier. The sounds of other passengers faded into something distant. At some point, he never knew exactly when, the train slowed. He felt it through the floor. His body responded automatically, muscle memory over thought. He gathered his things, stood, and stepped into the corridor with the dull determination of a man who believes he is almost done. When the train stopped, he got off. The platform was small. The air was sharp. Somewhere a lamplight glowed faintly, weak against the darkness. And as the train pulled away, its shape diminishing into the night, Samuel's mind cleared just enough for realization to hit him like cold water. This wasn't Blackwood. He stood there, suitcase in hand, watching the last of the train's tail lamps vanish down the track, and felt a wave of anger at himself so fierce it almost warmed him. He had ridden this route countless times. How could he make such a mistake? But anger did nothing. The train was gone. The schedule was not in his pocket. Another one would not come soon. Not at this hour. Not on a Sunday morning that was still hours away from being called morning. He could stay where he was and find lodging if there was any, or he could walk. Walking at this time, alone, exhausted, was not appealing. But the idea of not getting home at all, of sitting in a strange place while Bess waited and worried, felt worse. Samuel took a breath and looked out across the dark roads and the scattered lights in the distance. He needed help, a direction, someone to tell him where, exactly, he'd stranded himself. He stepped off the platform and followed what looked like a road toward those lights, his suitcase swinging against his leg, every step reminding him how tired he was. The night was quiet in that rural way, no city noise, no constant chatter, only distant wind and the occasional sound of something moving unseen. After a short walk, he reached an intersection, and there, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't quite meant, he saw another person, a uniform, a policeman. Relief flooded him so strongly his knees felt suddenly weak. He lifted a hand and called out, and the officer approached, his posture cautious. A man standing on a road at this hour, carrying luggage, was not a comforting sight. The officer's face was half shadowed by his cap when he came close enough to speak. He looked Samuel up and down, taking in the weariness, the clothes, the suitcase. "What are you doing out at this time?" the officer asked. Samuel explained, words tumbling out. Newport, work, the late train, the wrong stop. He admitted, with a grim little laugh, that he must have been half asleep when he stepped off. He asked where he was, and whether there was a place to stay, and, most importantly, whether it was possible to walk to Blackwood from here. The officer listened with the kind of patience that comes from long shifts and stranger stories. When Samuel finished, the officer nodded toward the road stretching away to the darkness. "You could stay in town," he said, meaning there were places. An inn, perhaps, or a room somewhere. Then he looked at Samuel's face again, and the stubbornness there, and he added, "But if you're set on home, you can do it on foot." "How far?" "An hour, give or take," the officer said. "Straight down that road. You'll come to a bridge. Once you're over it, you'll find signs. It's not complicated." An hour. Samuel pictured Bess by the fire. He pictured her listening for him, growing more anxious as each minute passed. He pictured the look she'd give him, relief followed by frustration, all in the same breath. "I'll walk," he said, and surprised himself with how certain he sounded. The officer hesitated, as if weighing whether to discourage him. Then he shrugged, the gesture resigned. "If you're going, keep to the road," he said. "Don't take shortcuts. It's darker than it looks." Samuel thanked him, adjusted his grip on his belongings, and started down the road toward Blackwood. At first, the walk felt manageable. His body warmed from movement. The steady pace gave him something to do with his exhaustion, besides collapse. But the further he went, the more the darkness seemed to gather. Roads at night can do that. They stop feeling like routes and start feeling like corridors, narrow and controlled, with trees and hedges on either side becoming walls. The wind moved through branches overhead, making a sound like whispered conversations. Somewhere in the distance, an animal cried out once, a sharp, lonely noise that made Samuel's stomach tighten. He told himself it was only the night doing what nights do. He told himself he was a grown man, not a boy afraid of shadows. Still, he found himself listening too intently, alert for footsteps behind him or movement in the fields. He walked on. His thoughts drifted, pulled back repeatedly to Bess, to her face, to the way she'd looked at him that morning, that odd seriousness. It nagged at him now. He regretted not asking her more, not insisting on hearing what had unsettled her. He was tired enough that his mind played tricks. In the corner of his vision, he'd catch shapes that looked like a person, then realize it was only a bush or a post. He'd think he heard the scrape of a footstep, then recognize it was his own suitcase dragging slightly. The road led him on, and time became strange. The hour the officer promised did not feel like an hour. It felt longer. It felt like a stretch of life that had no end. And then, ahead, he saw it. The bridge. A dark span over a darker drop. The kind of structure that looked harmless in daylight and ominous at night. The road rose slightly toward it. The air around it felt colder, as if the bridge carried its own weather. Samuel slowed. He shifted his suitcase to his other hand, flexed his fingers, and stepped onto the bridge. The world narrowed. The sound of his steps on the boards or stone, whatever surface it was, seemed louder here, amplified by the emptiness beneath. The railing was cold when his hand brushed it, damp with night moisture. He kept moving, head down against the wind. And somewhere within that darkness, within that ordinary, simple act of walking home, something happened. No one saw it. No one recorded the exact second. The world did not pause to mark it. Later, people would say it must have been exhaustion and darkness and a misstep, a stumble near the edge, a moment of dizziness. Perhaps he leaned too close. Perhaps his foot found a patch of slickness. The explanation would be easy because easy explanations are what the living prefer. All that could be said with certainty was that Samuel Hughes did not cross that bridge alive. Bess, in her house in Blackwood, heard the voice at 3. Bess. Bess. She heard it as clearly as she'd heard it 1,000 times before. She would insist later that she heard footsteps too. The familiar weight of his boots. The approach of a man coming up the path. When she opened the door, she saw the figure, robed in black clothes, wearing a tall hat, a silk hat, like the one Samuel often wore. And then it vanished. In the daylight, the event became difficult to hold in her mind, not because it felt less real, but because reality itself did not have a place for it. A woman does not open her door and find her husband's hat, worn by a stranger-shaped darkness, and then, with a blink, find only emptiness. So she tried to set it aside. Morning arrived. The house became ordinary again. Birds called outside. Neighbors moved about their own lives. The fire was refreshed. The kettle boiled. But Samuel did not come home. As the hours passed, the worry returned and grew heavier. It turned into something that sat on her chest when she tried to breathe. By Monday afternoon, when someone knocked at the door, Bess already had the feeling that the knock was not bringing her husband back. She opened the door to a policeman, his face set in a practiced expression that could not hide what it carried. He spoke. The words were polite, careful. "I have some terrible news." There are moments in grief when the mind becomes oddly calm, as if it steps back from the body to protect itself. Bess listened, and some part of her understood before the details arrived. Samuel was not merely late. Samuel was not merely delayed. Samuel was gone. The officer told her that Samuel Hughes had been found dead beneath a bridge at Crumlin. The inquest, he explained, or would explain, suggested an accident. A fall in the darkness, exhaustion, misfortune. Bess pressed a hand to her mouth, and the sound that came out of her was not a scream, but something smaller, something broken. Then, as if the mind had its own cruel logic, as if it needed to stitch events together to keep from unraveling entirely, she asked a question that surprised even her. "What time do you think he died?" The officer looked uncomfortable, not because the question was strange, but because it demanded specificity in the face of something that felt too big to measure. "Based on what we know," he said, "and the directions he was given, it would have been around 3 in the morning, roughly." 3. The number struck like a bell. Bess felt the porch return to her, the candlelight, the black figure, the silk hat. She swallowed and asked another question, her voice trembling now with something beyond grief. "When you found him," she said, "was he wearing his hat?" The officer frowned. "No," he said. "No hat." Bess lowered her gaze. Her hands, which had been shaking, went strangely still. Because she knew Samuel had left him that hat. She'd watched him put it on. She'd remembered it on the porch. And now she understood, or believed she understood, what the night had shown her. Samuel had come home anyway. Not as flesh and breath and warmth. Not as a man stepping off a train at the right station. Not as a husband returning to bed. But as something else. Something dressed in the last familiar shape he could offer, carrying the one detail she could not mistake. A way of saying, "It's me." A way of saying, "I tried." A way of saying goodbye. In the days that followed, the town would talk as towns always do. Some would treat it as a curious story, something to repeat with a shiver for entertainment. Some would dismiss it as grief and exhaustion playing on a woman's senses. Some would insist quietly that the dead sometimes return when love is strong enough to pull them. Bess, for her part, did not argue. She had lost her husband beneath a bridge, and she had opened her door to a figure in black wearing his hat. She knew what she heard. She knew what she saw. And yet, because life does not allow clean endings, there remained one small residue that never settled into peace. The hat itself was never part of the body they brought back. No one could tell her where it had gone. A silk hat is not a soul. It is not the kind of thing that vanishes without leaving a trace. If Samuel had fallen, where had it been flung? If it had been taken, by whom, at that hour, on that road? If it had ended up in the river or the brush, why had no one found it? Bess would sit later by the fire, alone now, the chair in the same place, and the question would come back to her like the echo of footsteps on a porch. Not the large question, why death? Why now? Why him? A smaller one, almost childish in its stubbornness. Where is the hat? And when she closed her eyes at night, she would sometimes hear it again. Not loud this time, not urgent, but close to the edge of sleep, like a memory that refuses to fade. Bess, the voice would say. Once, twice. And then the house would be quiet and she would lie there in the dark, holding the grief in both hands, wondering whether the dead can truly say goodbye, or whether they only learn new ways to haunt the people who loved them most. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.